Welcome to the Meteorology Matters podcast.
Great to be here.
We spend so much time, understandably, focused on the immediate power of big storms. You know, the wind, the rain, the flooding.
The crisis itself, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We think about something like Hurricane Helene, and that initial damage is just, well, immense. But the thing is, that physical destruction, that's really only half the story. Maybe less than half.
That's so true. The storm hits the headlines, absolutely. But for the communities, for the actual people on the ground, the real fight, the long fight, often starts after the skies clear.
Right. It becomes this whole other battle, a bureaucratic one, a financial one.
Right.
And if that goes wrong, it can be devastating in its own way.
Oh, absolutely. It can cripple local governments, leave families vulnerable for, years.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really get into that aftermath. The part we don't always see. We need to understand these cascading risks, the financial traps, the administrative hurdles that are built into the systems that are supposed to help us recover. We're going to be looking at some recent research that's really peeled back the layers on this. It's showing significant delays, some really surprising, frankly, inequities in federal disaster funding. And we'll focus particularly on how these systems played out after Hurricane Helene.
Yeah, and it's a complex picture. We'll start sort of high level, looking at the national picture, the preparedness grants states need before disaster hits.
Okay.
Then we'll zoom right into North Carolina, post-Helene, and see how local governments got caught in this reimbursement crisis.
That financial nightmare, basically.
Pretty much. And finally, maybe the most important part, we have to look at the individual level, the homeowners, because the research shows these stark, measurable differences in who actually gets the help they need.
It sounds like a system that maybe unintentionally ends up favoring those who already have more resources, more ability to just fight the system.
That's definitely a theme that emerges. Persistence and privilege seem to pay off.
Yeah.
It isn't how disaster agent work, is it?
No, it really isn't. Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start at the beginning, before the storm even arrives. You'd think state emergency management agencies, the frontline folks, would be fully equipped, ready to go.
That's the ideal, right? Funded, staffed, poised.
But the research suggests that they're often dealing with their own crisis before the main one hits, specifically around these federal grants they depend on.
Exactly. It's a preparedness paradox. Officials across the country are reporting, serious cuts, new rules, big delays in getting these federal security grants.
And these aren't just minor funds, are they?
No, not at all. This jeopardizes their basic ability to get ready and respond. And we're not just talking about hurricane prep anymore. These grants cover the whole spectrum of threats they now face.
Right, the job's gotten bigger.
Much bigger.
And this uncertainty, the not knowing when the money will arrive, that seems to cause its own problems. There was this quote from Hawaii's Emergency Management Agency. They called it grant purgatory.
Grant purgatory. That really nails it, doesn't it? It captures that feeling of being stuck.
Yep.
Because states don't know when or even if the funds will show up, it shrinks the window they have to actually spend the money effectively before the grant period expires.
So practically, what does that look like on the ground? How does being stuck in purgatory hurt their readiness?
Well, it forces bad decisions, essentially. They end up having to rush crucial training sessions. Maybe they pay higher rates because it's last minute.
Okay.
Or they make hurried purchases for equipment, possibly missing out on bulk discounts. And maybe worst of all, they hold off hiring people.
Because they can't guarantee the salary.
Exactly. So when the disaster does hit, they're already short-staffed. They might not have the best trained people or the right equipment bought efficiently. It's wasteful and dangerous.
Now, the research hints that maybe this is part of a bigger strategy, a push from the federal level to shift more responsibility onto states and local governments. Is that the official line?
Well, that's certainly a stated philosophy we've seen mentioned, shifting responsibility. But the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, they give a different reason for tightening the screws on these grants.
What's their rationale?
They talk about recent population shifts, which is a bit vague, honestly. And they also mention needing to be responsive to new and urgent threats facing our nation, which, to be fair, is true.
Right, like you said, it's not just floods and hurricanes anymore.
Exactly. Now it's cyber attacks, potential terror threats, pandemics. These things are complex, expensive to prepare for. They require totally different skill sets, different technology.
Which makes the grant money for salaries, for training, for software, even more critical than before.
Precisely. The need goes up, but access seems to be getting harder.
And then there was this specific, almost bizarre example of administrative friction. a new rule tied to immigration policy that actually stopped grant money in its tracks.
Yeah, this was a really stark case involving the Emergency Management Performance Grant, the EMPG.
Okay, what's that one for?
It's foundational. About $320 million nationwide. It pays for the basics, salaries, training, day-to-day operations for state emergency teams.
So essential stuff.
Absolutely essential. And FEMA, which is part of DHS, they officially obligated the money on September 29th. They basically said, okay, states, the money's approved, it's coming.
Green light, go ahead and plan.
Right. But then, literally, the very next day, bang, the funds were put on hold.
Just like that. Why?
A new directive came down. States suddenly had to submit new population counts, and these counts had to specifically exclude anyone removed from the state pursuant to the immigration laws of the United States.
Wow, okay, that sounds complicated.
Extremely. And they also had to explain exactly how they calculated that exclusion, the methodology.
So states are ready to gear up for disaster season, the money is legally theirs, and suddenly this completely separate political issue, immigration enforcement, freezes everything.
That's what happened. It created this massive administrative roadblock.
What made it so difficult to comply? Couldn't they just pull the numbers?
If only it were that simple. The federal government doesn't exactly have a neat, tidy, instantly accessible database of everyone removed for immigration reasons, broken down state by state that they can just hand over.
Right.
The term removed from the state is legally fuzzy too. So states would have had to spend who knows how much time, legal resources, just figuring out what the directive meant. Then they'd have to invent a way to gather data from potentially dozens of different sources, justify that method.
All while the clock is ticking on disaster season and their grant funding is locked up.
Exactly. It sounds like a recipe for paralysis. An intentional bottleneck almost, based on a requirement that was practically impossible to meet quickly.
What's fascinating here is how something seemingly straightforward, like funding disaster preparedness, gets tangled up in these other political or administrative agendas.
It really is. It shows how these complex federal rules, even if they have some other stated policy goal, can directly weaken our ability to prepare for emergencies right when we need that certainty the most. It just gums up the works.
Okay, so that's the pre-disaster picture. Readiness is already strained. Now, let's shift to what happens after the storm hits. Hurricane Helene and the situation in North Carolina. This is where that strain really seemed to break the system.
Yeah, the focus shifts from preparedness grants to reimbursement. After Helene, more than a year later, many local counties in North Carolina were facing, potential financial ruin.
Not from the storm damage itself, but because the federal money they were owed wasn't arriving.
Precisely. It was these huge, unusual delays in FEMA paying them back for the cleanup costs.
Local governments have to act immediately, right? They clear the roads, rescue people, haul away mountains of debris. They pay for that up front.
They have to. It's legally required.
Yeah.
They operate on tight budgets, often balanced budgets by law, and they float massive amounts of cash, assuming FEMA's public assistance program, the PA program, will reimburse them reasonably quickly.
Let's look at Yancey County, North Carolina. The research used it as a really stark example. How much did they end up spending on cleanup after Helene?
Almost $50 million.
$50
million.
Okay, that's a lot for any county, but especially a rural one. How much had FEMA paid back after a full year?
$4 million. Just $4 million out of nearly $50 million spent.
Wow. That's, what, less than 10%?
Yeah, an enormous gap. And get this, the county manager pointed out that Yancey County's entire annual budget for everything, police, schools, roads, the works, was only $37 million.
Wait, so the cleanup bill alone was more than their whole operating budget for the year?
Correct. About $37 million just for debris removal. They spent a year's worth of revenue in a few months, and the reimbursement basically wasn't coming.
That's just mathematically impossible. How can a county possibly absorb that?
They can't. It's utterly unsustainable. And Yancey wasn't alone. Avery County nearby had a similar story.
What happened there?
A commissioner there mentioned hauling away over 1 million cubic yards of vegetative debris. Think about that volume.
Yeah.
The cost was $53 million.
Okay.
Their total county budget for the year, $42 million.
Again, spending more on cleanup than their entire annual budget.
Yeah. The commissioner had this quote. He just said, "That math don't math."
No kidding.
It perfectly captured the impossible spot they were in. They had to raid their reserve funds, dip into every possible account just to try and keep paying the contractors who were doing the actual cleanup work.
This sounds like a crisis caused entirely by delayed paperwork, not the storm itself. And was there also a feeling that North Carolina maybe wasn't getting its fair share compared to neighbors?
There was. Looking at the initial public assistance money obligated by FEMA right after Helene, the numbers do raise questions.
How so?
North Carolina obviously had massive damage, hundreds of roads, bridges destroyed. Research cited damage to something like 73,000 homes. Huge impact.
Okay.
Yet, for debris removal specifically, FEMA initially obligated $132 million for North Carolina.
All right, $132 million. How does that compare?
Well, look next door. Georgia also had significant damage from Helene. They received $690 million for debris removal.
Whoa. $132 million versus $690 million. That's a massive difference. What about other states?
Florida got $192 million. Tennessee got $159 million. Even looking at the total public assistance picture, not just debris, North Carolina was initially down for about $849 million, while Georgia was set for $922 million.
So across the board, North Carolina seemed to be getting less, especially for debris removal, despite having really extensive damage. Why such a big gap? Was it just different types of damage, different rules?
It's tough to say definitively. There could be multiple factors, but officials in North Carolina certainly felt the new level of bureaucratic review and scrutiny was part of the reason for that lower initial number.
And that just made the later payment delays even worse.
Exactly. It compounded the problem. In fact, North Carolina's governor estimated the state still has over $40 billion with a B in its own unfunded needs from Helene. So they felt shortchanged on the initial federal amount, and then the money they were promised got stuck.
Right. A double whammy. So low obligation, slow payment. Either way, it leads to this cash flow crisis for local governments. And the official reason given for these delays, these new layers of red tape.
The stated reason, coming from the secretary overseeing FEMA payments at the time, Kristi Noem, was about rooting out fraud, waste, and abuse. Increasing accountability, making sure taxpayer money is spent wisely, that's the official rationale.
Okay, fighting fraud is important, obviously.
Of course. But state and local officials on the ground, they were singing a very different tune. They described the result as just paralyzing bureaucracy. Delays far beyond anything they'd seen before. Abnormal was a word used a lot. They felt the new system actually created massive inefficiency.
And the research spelled out what this new red tape actually involved. It wasn't just one extra step.
No, it was like a triple-layered approval process, almost stacked on top of each other.
Triple layer. Okay, what were the layers?
First, you still had the standard FEMA process for reviewing claims, which is already pretty detailed and time-consuming.
Right, that's layer one.
Layer two, the DHS secretary herself had to personally sign off on every single expense over $100,000.
Every single one. Over $100,000. That must be thousands of claims after a major hurricane.
You'd imagine so. It sounds like an incredible bottleneck right there at the top.
Okay, so standard FEMA, then the secretary's personal sign-off. What's the third layer?
The third hurdle was getting clearance from a new system run by a Department of Government Efficiency called Defend the Spend.
Defend the spend.
Yeah. Another complex clearance site they had to navigate. As one state official apparently put it, maybe the intention was good, maybe they wanted to streamline things, but the effect was building 3 review systems where one used to be.
So instead of catching fraud more efficiently, it just drowned legitimate claims in paperwork.
That seems to be the consensus from the people trying to get reimbursed. They felt they were proving the same expenses 3 different times to 3 different entities.
This really highlights that conflict, doesn't it? The top level says, we need this to stop fraud, but the local level says, this is stopping legitimate recovery. Is there any actual evidence this triple system caught significant fraud that the old system missed?
That's the key question, and the research didn't point to clear evidence of that. State emergency managers tend to argue that major fraud, the sophisticated stuff, usually gets caught later, during detailed audits after the money has flowed.
Right, not by adding more upfront approval steps for time-sensitive things like getting roads cleared.
Exactly. They argue these pre-approval layers mainly just slow down payments to legitimate contractors who did essential work immediately after the storm. That hurts the local economy, risks contractor bankruptcy, and doesn't necessarily stop someone determined to commit fraud later in the process.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, what's the ultimate danger for these counties forced to carry these huge debts for so long?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the biggest risk is to their credit ratings.
Ah, the bond ratings.
Precisely. This is a massive deal, especially in a state like North Carolina. They have historically super strict fiscal rules. Counties literally cannot run deficits or carry debt like this.
That's why they usually have such good bond ratings, right?
Exactly. They've historically had more AAA bond ratings than almost anywhere else because of that discipline. But that strength suddenly became a huge weakness when FEMA wasn't paying its bills.
Walk us through why that bond rating matters so much to the average person living there. If it drops from AAA to, say, AA,
So what? It costs everyone money. A lower bond rating tells lenders this county is now a slightly riskier bet.
Okay.
So the next time the county needs to borrow money, maybe to build a new school, fix a bridge, upgrade the water system,
Right.
they have to pay a higher interest rate on those municipal bonds they issue.
Because they're seen as riskier.
Right. And that difference in interest, maybe it sounds small, like 0.5%, but compound that over the 20 or 30 years they're paying back that bond, it adds up to hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, in extra interest payments.
Paid for by?
Local taxpayers. So that bureaucratic delay on a $100,000 reimbursement check from FEMA ends up costing the whole community more money down the road for basic public services. It's a long-term financial drain caused by a short-term administrative failure.
And in the meantime, communities are just stuck. There was that story about families waiting for buyout money.
Yeah, devastating. In one county, 111 families applied for a hazard mitigation buyout, basically selling their flood-prone properties to the government so they can move somewhere safer.
A huge decision for those families.
Life-changing. FEMA apparently approved $16 million to buy about 40 of those properties, offering free storm value, a chance to start over.
That sounds like a good program in theory.
In theory, yes. But the money just hasn't arrived. It hasn't been paid out at all.
So these families are just waiting, living in campers or temporary housing.
Exactly. They agreed to the deal. They're waiting for the final paperwork, waiting for the check. And meanwhile, the seasons are changing, maybe winter's coming, and they're stuck in limbo. Likely because the funds are caught up in those same stalled approval layers we talked about. A federal promise just hanging unfulfilled.
That's heartbreaking. Okay, so local governments are struggling. Individuals are stuck in limbo. Let's shift focus entirely now to the individual homeowners trying to get direct help from FEMA, the individual assistance, or IA.
Right, because the research shows that even when the money is flowing, it's not flowing equally. The bureaucratic hurdles and maybe even internal FEMA issues seem to create real disparities based on income.
How significant are these disparities?
The analysis is pretty stark. In those really hard-hit rural counties like Yancey and Haywood, the research found homeowners with the highest incomes ended up receiving 2 to 3 times more FEMA housing aid than homeowners with lower incomes.
2 to 3 times more. Wait, let's clarify IA. That's the money for basic repairs, making a home safe and livable again, right? Or for temporary rent.
Correct. It's direct help to families. And technically, FEMA aid is supposed to be sort of blind to your income or your home's pre-storm value.
It doesn't matter if you had a mansion or a mobile home. The goal is the same: baseline habitability.
That's the principle. Safe, sanitary, functional. You know, FEMA might cover repairs for one basic bedroom, one bathroom, maybe replace one fridge for a couple, regardless of what they owned before. It's about essential needs.
But the reality in Haywood County, for example, was very different. What were the numbers there?
In Haywood, the data showed households earning over $75,000 a year typically got around $22,000 in housing assistance.
Okay. And those earning less than $75,000.
They received about $8,000 on average.
Wow. $22,000 versus $8,000. That is a huge gap for essentially the same program. It looks like a penalty for being lower income.
It does function that way, even if it's not intentional discrimination written into the rules. The question becomes why? If the aid standard is the same, why does the person with less money get less help for similar damage?
What does the research suggest causes this?
It seems to be a combination of things, really boiling down to the process itself being incredibly difficult to navigate, especially if you lack resources.
So it starts with the application and inspection.
Yeah. The research mentioned that FEMA inspectors might sometimes undervalue the damage to more modest homes.
Why would they do that?
It could be subtle things. Maybe the home doesn't have standard building permits, or formal appraisal documents aren't readily available, which might be more common in lower income or rural areas. The inspector might default to a lower damage estimate if the paperwork isn't perfect.
Or maybe they misjudge the type of damage, like calling structural damage just minor water damage.
Exactly. They might use standardized methods that just don't capture the reality of fixing up an older or less conventionally built home, so the initial payout offer is low.
And if you disagree, if you know the damage is worse,
then you face the appeals process, and the research describes that process as just brutal and discouraging. The amount of documentation required, the back and forth, it's overwhelming.
And that's where the resource gap really kicks in.
Precisely. If you're already struggling, maybe you lost your job, you're living in a shelter, finding food. The idea of gathering contractor estimates, chasing down receipts from years ago, spending hours on hold with FEMA, it becomes almost impossible.
Whereas someone with more financial stability may be paid leave from work.
They have the luxury of time, as the research put it, and the mental energy. Look at the story of the Hills.
Here are the public school teachers.
Right, both teachers. Schools were closed for 7 weeks after the storm, but they kept getting their full paychecks. That stability was crucial. It allowed them, in their words, to pursue every dollar. They had the time and headspace to fight the bureaucracy.
While others just can't. The stress, maybe PTSD from the disaster itself, makes battling paperwork feel insurmountable.
Absolutely. For many, just surviving day to day takes everything they have. Aggressively pursuing aid isn't an option.
Let's contrast the Hills story, who eventually got close to the maximum aid.
Yeah, they showed incredible persistence. They kept pestering FEMA, as they put it, uploading documents, getting new estimates, appealing decisions. It took months.
But it worked out in the end.
Relatively speaking, yes. They got close to the max IA amount, around $32,500 back then. That, plus a GoFundMe that raised over $15,000 and help from volunteer builders. It allowed them to do something amazing. They actually moved their entire historic house off its foundation and onto higher ground, away from the creek that flooded it.
Wow. So they could rebuild because they had the resources and the tenacity to fight the system and supplement the aid.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Michelle Parker, about 40 miles away in Haywood County.
Her story was just heartbreaking, repeat disasters.
Yeah. She and her husband, Jeff, had already lost their home once before, rebuilt, and then Helene wiped them out again. They applied for one of those hazard mitigation buyouts we mentioned, a process that takes years. In the meantime, they were living in a donated camper.
Just trying to get basic rental assistance.
Even that was a constant battle. Months of nagging FEMA, uploading papers, trying to understand these incredibly confusing letters they send out, endless phone calls.
She was dealing with all this stress.
And then the absolute tragedy, her husband died suddenly of cardiac arrest that June.
Oh my goodness.
In the midst of that grief, the system basically failed her again. Because then, major floods hit Texas in July. FEMA got overwhelmed. Resources shifted.
They know what it has on the phone.
They ballooned from already long waits to 2, even 3 hours on hold.
3 hours on hold.
And Michelle just gave up. She stopped trying to get the additional rental assistance she was likely entitled to. She told her researchers simply, "I got tired of calling."
I got tired of calling. That says it all, doesn't it? When you're grieving, living in a camper, the idea of spending 3 hours on hold is just too much.
It is. It shows how the system itself, the administrative burden, the long waits, becomes the barrier. Recovery becomes a privilege for those who have the time, the energy, the emotional reserves to keep fighting that battle.
It's not just about the money, it's about the capacity to pursue it.
Exactly. The bureaucratic load filters out the most vulnerable.
And the terrible irony here is that FEMA actually knew this was a problem. They were trying to fix their outdated, confusing application system.
That's right. Their main website, disasterassistance.gov, the place survivors apply. It's apparently built on tech that's like 17 years old.
Ancient in tech terms.
Totally. And survivors using it often just see the word pending for weeks or months. No clear updates, no sense of where their application actually is. It's like a black hole.
Not exactly user-friendly.
Not at all. So FEMA wanted to modernize it, give people clear, maybe Amazon-style updates, application received, inspection scheduled, payment approved, transparency.
That sounds like a great idea. Did they make progress?
They had hired a really impressive team to do it. Engineers, designers, product managers dedicated to overhauling this system.
How big was that team?
At its peak, research suggests there were at least 20 specialized in-house people working on this digital modernization.
Okay, a serious effort. What happened?
Well, this coincided with administration efforts to significantly cut FEMA's overall workforce. They lost maybe up to a quarter of their staff in some areas.
And the modernization team?
It just evaporated. That team of 20 or more experts shrank down to only 2 people.
Two people trying to fix and maintain a 17-year-old system processing claims from massive disasters nationwide.
It's staggering, isn't it? Think about trying to run a major online service with just 2 people on the back end during peak demand. It's impossible.
So the hope for a more transparent, user-friendly system basically died.
Pretty much. Without that dedicated in-house expertise, major improvements became incredibly unlikely. So survivors are still stuck with confusing communication, inconsistent information, and these unequal outcomes we've been talking about. The system remains opaque and difficult.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together. We started out wanting to understand the risks after the storm, and the research seems to show this pattern, this bottleneck, really at every single stage.
Yeah, it's like a pipeline that's clogged up at multiple points. And the failures aren't isolated, they compound each other.
Right. So point one, readiness is undermined before the storm because preparedness grants get delayed or frozen, sometimes for reasons completely unrelated to disasters, like that EMPG issue.
Which forces states into less efficient spending and leaves them short-staffed when the crisis hits.
Then, point two, after the storm, local governments doing the essential cleanup face potential bankruptcy because the reimbursement system gets bogged down by new layers of review, like defend the spend.
Right, layers supposedly for fighting fraud, but which primarily just slow down legitimate payments, potentially damaging county credit ratings and costing taxpayers more in the long run.
And finally, at point three, when individuals try to get help, the process itself is so burdensome and maybe hampered by internal FEMA issues like the failed digital upgrade and staff cuts that it ends up favoring those with more resources.
Yeah, creating these measurable income disparities where higher income folks get significantly more aid simply because they have the time and stability to navigate the brutal appeals process.
So the bottom line seems to be a systemic slowdown across the board. Whether it's intentional policy choices, bureaucratic inertia, workforce issues, or political priorities interfering, the end result is that the money pipeline for recovery gets constricted.
And crucially, at every stage of that slowdown, it's the most vulnerable who are hit hardest. The small towns with tiny staffs, the lower-income families without savings or paid leave, they're the ones least equipped to fight the bureaucratic machine.
Which leads to this really important question, doesn't it?
This raises an important question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We see the system rewards persistence, it rewards resources. It almost requires a certain level of privilege just to navigate disaster recovery successfully. So, as these extreme weather events become more common, more intense, what can communities do? Especially the smaller ones, the ones with fewer resources to begin with. How can they prepare not just for the wind and rain, but for the inevitable bureaucratic battle that comes afterwards? How do you build capacity for that fight?
That is the question, isn't it? It shifts the idea of resilience. It's not just about building stronger levees. It's about building stronger administrative muscle, better advocacy, maybe pre-disaster legal prep at the local level. That's a whole different kind of preparedness.
A provocative thought indeed. Something for all of us, especially community leaders, to really consider. Well, thank you for walking us through that complex and, frankly, quite sobering research. It's a crucial perspective on what happens long after the cameras leave.
Absolutely. Important stuff to understand. Stay informed, everyone, and stay safe.
And before you go, please do take a moment to like, follow, comment, or rate the Meteorology Matters podcast. It really helps others find the show.
Yeah, definitely appreciate the support.
And for more expert weather insights, be sure to follow meteorologist Rob Jones. You can find him on Instagram. His handle is meteorologist. On TikTok, he's TV meteorologist.
That's right.
And check out his YouTube channel by following Rob Jones Hurricane. That's also where you can find the full playlist for this podcast, Meteorology Matters.
Lots of great content there.
Absolutely. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.